So with student suicide being on the rise at national level, do you think that universities should be doing more to target these issues of mental health at university? And what do you think Warwick specifically should be doing in this regard?
So I'll take the second bit first. So we put more investment into the mental health provision and support. We are doing a lot of work at the moment around suicide-safe universities in terms of where we stand, what our strategy is. What's clear, I think, from that work is that we've got lots of different areas of activity, but we need to bring it together. This is a piece of work with the SU into one clear, visible strategy that we can adopt. We have somebody new who's come in to oversee that, who's got a lot of experience within the sector, but also beyond the sector. So I think that there's a lot of work in terms of strategy, more investment, but also we need to work collaborative. So that takes to the first part of your question. We need to do a lot more work collaborative. Universities UK have done a lot of work in this area, as you well know, partly, of course, coming out of the terrible series of events at Bristol University. And we're part of that, engaged very much with them, looking in particular to listen and learn what other people are doing. Because of course the last thing we want is each individual university to start reinventing the wheel itself. There's lots of good practice out there that we can learn from and engage with. So I think there's a lot of work. It's an ongoing process. If I may say, I think the Minister's contributions haven't been terribly helpful. The Minister's contributions about Minister for Universities, about this is the primary purpose of universities. It's not the primary purpose of universities, but it's a really important part of being a university and supporting students. The primary purpose of universities, of course, is around education and research. There may be things that we can learn from other sectors as well. And I think that's one of the other interesting things in the Universities UK work is looking at other sectors and possibly even other countries. I think the fundamental problem is that nobody yet has an extremely clear explanation of why it is that the mental health challenge, or at least an uncontested, straightforward explanation of why it is that the mental health challenges of contemporary student generations are increasing so alarmingly. And that's a fundamental piece of research work I think that we and other universities are doing.
So we'd also like to ask you about student accommodation. So at the beginning of this academic year, SU President Liam Jackson termed the university's struggle with student accommodation, with students being housed in Feldon Conference Centre and more sharing rooms than usual, as a crisis. Last year, after the university experienced problems with accommodation, you told the board that you felt that the university had over-provided to make sure you would not experience the same problems again. So what would you say was the issue this year? And do you think that the university overstretched itself?
So this is a really big issue. Let's go back to last year before we come to this year. So the question about last year was very much about the total provision, so including postgraduates, including off-campus. And what we had done last year is to over-provide in terms of the nomination agreements that we had with private sector providers, so that in particular for postgraduates there was absolutely going to be a guaranteed bed somewhere. So come to this year, this year we didn't have a crisis. And I think, to be fair, if you ask Liam again now, I think he would say we didn't have a crisis. What we did is we planned prudentially for what might happen if larger numbers of students turned up than we thought we would. So Feldon, for example, we haven't used. But we took some decisions to say we would take this away from the conference centre were it to be the case that we needed that additional accommodation. So let's just have a moment, if I may, think about student numbers, because this is a really important part of the whole process, and of course the other part of what it was that Liam was quoted in the board was saying. We had last year an extraordinary change. We had more student applications to the university than ever before. And we had more student applications in every single category, so more undergraduate, more postgraduate, more British, more rest of the European Union, more international. In the postgraduate master space, we had a 25% increase in applications. So the first part of this process, we want to be open, we want to have fair access to students, but we've also got to manage those numbers. The first part of this process was to try to take that enormous increase in demand and turn it into something manageable. I think we did that pretty well, because by the time we got to the Welcome Week, in terms of undergraduate numbers, we were 0.2% over the target that we'd set. By the time we came to the end of Welcome Week, and the end of week one, that had increased to 4% over. So we had a large number of students coming after, saying they're going to come, actually turning up after we would normally expect people to turn up. And again, there was an increase also on the postgraduate side. So one of the things that's also happening is that student behaviour is changing. It's less predictable. And a lot of the algorithms that we've set try to work out to make sure that we land as close as possible to our target are needing to be looked at again, and we've got a project looking at that this year. Going over target is a problem as well as going under target. It really is a problem. So we are trying to land on the numbers that we set and we plan for. And as a consequence of that, we're trying to work very clearly to make sure that we do give the accommodation that we say that we'll give to the students. But there wasn't a crisis this year. You know, what you collectively picked up on is all the preparation planning were we to be in a more difficult position. Did I answer all the bits of your question? I'm not sure I did. Was there another piece that I haven't answered?
I said, do you think... I said, so what do you think went wrong in terms of over-provision, and do you think the university overstretched itself?
Okay, so no and no.
Whilst many students were of course horrified at the content of the group chat incident at the end of the last academic year, concerns were raised that the context was a private conversation and thus an invasion of privacy to display in the media. So do you think that a private group chat should be the subject of media attention?
So again, let me not comment on the specific case, but take the general point that you're making. How can I do that? Let me think carefully how I do that. Of course, part of the issue is private chat becoming public. And private chat becoming public is something, frankly, that everyone should always think about. Private chat very rarely stays private chat. Being very old and talking to people who are as old as me, we sat around last year and talked about, do you remember conversations of that sort in the pub? Because there wasn't social media. Can you imagine such a day there wasn't social media? And frankly, when people would say some of these sorts of things, there'd be someone to say, don't, you mustn't, don't, what have you thought about, that's terrible. And some of these private social media spaces kind of amplify things, and there are people who are going to check. But frankly, anybody who assumes that any kind of social media isn't going to become public is deluding themselves. It is always only a matter of time. None of these things are ever going to stay private because it involves people. So I think that the distinction in a sense is quite a false one. If you won't say something in public, maybe don't say it in private, because maybe it's going to become public, and maybe you should be consistent about who you are, being authentic as a person.
So moving on to free speech, from free speech to society initiations. So the death of the student at Newcastle University during society initiation processes is making headlines again, and has revived concern around the issue of uncontrolled society initiations at universities. In 2014, the Men's Rugby Union Society at the University of Warwick was banned for allegedly dangling a student off of terrace bar during initiations. In regards to initiation processes at Warwick, the SU must approve initiations, as we understand it, which can also be referred to as adoptions at Warwick. Yet we still hear quite horrific stories with students being placed in danger or compromising situations. Do you think that university should introduce more guidelines into these events that can possibly end in serious harm?
So I don't hear, and this is a really important point in terms of media engagement, I don't hear about what you have just said in this university. And if there are stories about what is happening to students in this context at this university, they absolutely have to be surfaced. It's not good enough to keep them within societies, because the sorts of things that we're seeing being revealed at the moment are unacceptable. Now, exactly as you say, the SU takes the lead in this. It's the SU societies. So as you say, the SU has a process not only of agreeing what these processes would be, but also of trying to engage and to educate the clubs and societies before they get to that point. And that's been a long ongoing process of work, actually well before 2014, that the SU have led on this. What I see and hear at the moment, I feel that is working well. If there is evidence that it's not, that really must be surfaced, because that is something that must be challenged. But I think the SU is doing a really good job in this space. I think it is for us as a university to say, and for me to say, that the sorts of things we're reading about at the moment at other universities is absolutely unacceptable. But if there's more for us to do, then it would be because the SU, I think, at this point would be asking us to do more, and I think they feel they've got some control on it. So if there are other stories, it's a really important appeal, but they really need to be surfaced.
So with regards to the recent higher education equal pay dispute, 71% of those who returned their ballot papers at the University of Warwick, which equated to 261 members of staff, voted in favour of strike action. However, the turnout was 36.1%, thus not hitting the threshold. The UCU have expressed that they feel that this result and turnout exemplifies how trade union laws frustrate national support for strike action on pay. Do you agree, and do you think that more should be done at Warwick?
No, I don't agree on that particular point. I'll say more about Warwick in a moment. I don't agree on that particular point. 261 is not a very large number of people to come and vote for a strike which would have very significant impact, obviously, across students learning across the institution. So I don't accept that point. Now, the broader point is about pay, and the broader point is about pay levels. And of course, this dispute has come about, and it's not just with the UCU, of course, because employers as a whole, there's a national pay bargaining scheme. Employers as a whole were unable to come to an agreement with the trades unions, and so the offer of 2% was turned into an imposition of 2% pay rise for this year. 2% is not wildly different to inflation, but it is. If the unions were sitting here, they would say, don't just look at that in isolation, look at what's happened over the last several years. And that is absolutely a reasonable perspective to take. The problem that we've got at the moment is that there is massive uncertainty across the whole of higher education. There's uncertainty because of Brexit, and what will be the financial implications of Brexit, as well as all the other really important concerns about Brexit. Hope somebody's going to ask about Brexit. If not, let me say something at the end. We've had the pensions dispute. Now, a resolution to the pensions dispute will be more expensive for employers. So there's additional cost that's going to go there as well. And then we also have running alongside this the review that the government has commissioned by Philip Auger to look at fee levels and funding for universities. If you add those together and you say each of those might have financially negative consequences, there absolutely are universities in this country that are worrying about becoming bankrupt. This is not one. This is not one. And so we have a stretch now where the size and effectiveness of some universities mean, on things like pay, we could pay more. And we have other institutions that are frankly going to really struggle to pay that 2%. So we have a stretch, and it's of course exactly what you'd expect in a more marketised system. Some institutions are doing better, some institutions are doing worse. And while you have a national bargaining scheme, a national agreement scheme, you're always going to compromise somewhere in the middle of that, and probably actually towards the lower end, because there are real jobs at risk at that lower end. So that's the context in which we're operating. Some of those risks and challenges will be clearer before next year's pay round emerges. But they might not be clear in a positive way in terms of university finances. So this is an issue which is simply not going to go away, I think, over the next few years, probably.
On the same issue of strikes, going back to our previous question, why do you think that a low number of staff returned their ballot paper? Would you see this as voting fatigue on behalf of staff?
No, I think a lot of staff actually understand that wider context of the financial position, and that it's very hard to see a radical change in the pay position before the pensions position is resolved. So for the 67 universities who were involved with the USS dispute at the moment, the scale of money that might be involved in keeping that system alive is potentially phenomenal. So very technically, but very, very briefly, because at the moment there is no agreed position by the employers and the unions to go forward to the USS trustees. The USS trustees have invoked their emergency mechanism, and their emergency mechanism is about essentially making sure that employers and employees are contributing enough to keep the system alive. Nobody wants to see the pension scheme crash in the way that other pension schemes have crashed. But that means that for employers, whereas currently we have been paying 18% of somebody's salary into the pension, that will increase to 24.9% over the course of the next 18 months. That 6+% of extra costs is going to be, depending on the size of the university, £7 to £10 million extra. That's a lot of extra money that's going to come out of budgets which haven't been budgeted for. And I think people know that. People who are voting, of course, were people who are paying a lot of it, or not voting. People who had the opportunity to vote, and people who paid a lot of attention to the pensions dispute, are very well aware of the sums of money that are involved, depending on how this resolves and works out. And I think, therefore, we're actually quite a knowledgeable electorate. So I think there's a lot of that context which is important as well, which is, of course, another reason why it's so important that we get to a resolution, an acceptable resolution that protects benefits on pensions over the course of the next few months.
Okay, we'd like to give you a chance to talk about Brexit now.
Yeah.
So part of the role of Vice-Chancellor, as we understand it, is to secure a financial basis for the university. Do you think this will struggle in the face of Brexit?
So Brexit is a disaster. It could be a catastrophe. And the catastrophe option, of course, is the no-deal option. Because in a catastrophe option, a no-deal option, everything falls apart, everything falls away. So what do I mean by that? In terms of those research projects that a lot of people have around the university, £16 million a year comes from Europe that's spent on research, which hires a lot of people, a lot of jobs are dependent on that. Would be absolutely at risk. Government says it will put some money in for the short term, but we're looking for the medium term. We have people on longer term contracts than between here and 2020. So that's a massive, you asked the financial question, that's a massive challenge. We don't know, of course, what the position will be in terms of fees for students from the rest of the European Union come 2020. That's a major challenge. People in and around government say it will be okay because we can just charge international fees. I don't want to do that. I want to keep the same basis. Because we have fabulous numbers of students coming from the European Union, and we want to support that. And we know in some programs there are higher proportions of students in the European Union than others, so we want to maintain that balance. That would be at risk from that which is going forward.
Erasmus as well.
Just go in there. The no-deal catastrophe scenario is, of course, in terms of Erasmus, Peter's quite right to pick this up. We absolutely have commitments to students to go on their Erasmus exchanges. Those exchange agreements fall away in a no-deal scenario. We absolutely will honour every single one of those. But it'll be phenomenally hard to put that together, and there'll be a lot of resource that we'll need to put in to staffing, to redevelop those legal relationships with all of our partners in order to make sure that happens in this period as well. So there are lots of knock-on consequences. If you come away from no deal into hard Brexit, those consequences are not quite as bad, but they're pretty terrible. They are pretty terrible. Apologies to anybody who supports Brexit in this room, because you're not going to hear anything very nice for the next couple of minutes. So we absolutely are facing major financial challenges, and they could be enormous financial challenges. But of course, that's not the main problem. That's a subsidiary problem. The main problem is about the relationships that we have as a university and that we have as a community with the rest of Europe. We're a European country, we're a European university. We cannot have those connections broken or even put at risk, frankly, by what the government is doing at the moment. I keep looking at Peter because he doesn't want me to go too far. I mean, I can go on a long time about this. So we have to take every opportunity that we can to maintain and support our relationships as a university with other European institutions. And at the moment, we're working very hard on putting together an application for a European university network, formerly called a mackerel network, which is about trying to get a relatively small number of universities to work much more closely together, particularly around education. So around mobility, around joint programs, actually about learning from each other. We all set up our student unions in different ways. We all set up our societies in different ways. Actually, is there learning across different universities and different countries that we can get together on, and also to have opportunities to build those long-term relationships as well. So we're taking that's just the most immediate example, countervailing measures to try to deal with this, because the fundamental problem, although financial is a worry, the fundamental problem is we are a European university and we have to stay part of Europe.
So with what you just said about, what you just said to us about potential rising tuition fees as a result of Brexit, do you think that the service delivered by universities could still be deemed value for money should tuition fees rise?
What would you describe as value for money?
So for the service provided by universities, is it going to improve along with the increase in tuition fees, or are students just going to be paying more for exactly what they could have gone?
The reason I asked the question, of course, is because value for money is interpreted in different ways, because and in particular, of course, the university's minister and really government as a whole seems to see value for money purely in terms of the salary that somebody gets after 5 years. Now, actually, of course, in terms of the Warwick data, we score very highly in that because we have brilliant people who do brilliant things and they go on and are very successful. But I don't want to accept that as the value for money definition, to be honest. I think the value for money definition is much more about the journey that you are all on as people here, arriving and then graduating. Who do you become? What do you learn? What are the networks you develop? How do you experiment with who you are, doing things like this? in clubs and societies, that's the real value to you as people, I hope, as well as good degrees, as well as good jobs afterwards. And I really want to put that front and central. And I wanted to ask you what you meant for it in order really as a device to say that. Because if we lose that as universities, then we are completely commodified. And we don't want to be completely commodified. So just to wind back, what I was trying to say was, government has the opportunity not to turn to people, students, in a few years' time coming from France, and saying universities are required to treat you exactly the same as people from the rest of the world. Government has the opportunity to do that. Or government can say, actually, somebody from France has to be treated like somebody from the rest of the world. My preference is that for students coming from Europe, because we're a European community, we should all be treated in the same way. I don't have much confidence that this government at this time shares that view. I'm not talking about general increases before the front page comes out. I'm not talking about a general increase in fees across the piece.
Indeed, we mentioned fees review earlier. The fees might actually potentially fall that review. The question of where we get resources to sustain that. A little bit more specifically about that.
So there is this big review that Boar is putting on at the moment, which clearly comes out of the Labour Party's offer to turn fees to zero. In fact, of course, the Labour Party position is more sophisticated than that, because what they're saying is that the student doesn't pay, the state will pay. And we know that that's, of course, a system that's used in many other countries, and it's going to cost them, including their commitments on maintenance grants, 11 billion. So where there are concerns about that is obviously, firstly, where is that 11 billion going to come from? But that's what is asked of every single opposition. And the second thing is the experience of universities through the 80s and the 90s, when there was a system where government paid everything, was that each year there wasn't quite the inflation increase. So over a period of 20 years, the unit of teaching resource radically declined, which is part of the argument that moved towards the fees regime. Not arguing in favour of that, just describing where we are. So that people then say to the Labour Party, well, you're saying 11 billion, you might find it now, but what happens in 2025, what happens in 2030? And I think actually they've got quite good answers to that. I think they've got quite good, if you accept they can get the money, if you can get yourself into that door, I think they've got quite good answers when you go from there. In contrast, government has set up a review which is looking at the whole of post-18 education. I think that's a really good thing. You know, why would you look at higher education in one space and further education in a different space, and indeed apprenticeships in yet another space? So I think that is a good idea. But a lot of things that are coming from government at the moment is that money will be cut from the headline fee for universities, and some of that money will be moved across to other parts of further education, whatever. And the money, therefore, that is cut from fees will not be made up by government teaching grants. If that's the case, depending on the scale of it, there are major financial implications for universities. So one number that floats around, none of this is of course guaranteed. All this goes through the political process. Everything can change. But one number that is being floated around at the moment is £6,500. The student pays £6,500 through the student loan company, and with whatever repayment arrangement they agree from after that. But universities do not get the fee made up from 6,500 to 9,250, and indeed 6,500 is then flatlined. So over time, as inflation increases, the value of that declines. That will have a massive financial implication for universities. And for universities that are very heavily dependent financially on undergraduate British and European students, in terms of their finances, it could have a catastrophic impact. Because if you're suddenly losing a third of your income, it's quite hard to imagine how you're going to cope with that. As a university, we're in a very different place. So only half of our income comes from all student fees. And so that which would be affected would be much smaller. So we are certainly not facing any kind of existential threat. But of course, it would mean that we would have to reschedule quite a lot of our plans were we to be in that kind of position. So that fear that a lot of universities have at the moment is immediate about what the Augur report might do and what government might do with it, much more so than what the Labour Party is saying. And I think that's 100% different from this time last year, when lots of universities were worried about what the Labour Party was saying and not so much what the government was saying. And it could all change again in a year.
Where do you see the university in 5 years' time? And do you still see yourself as Vice-Chancellor then?
Yes to the second part. So I could give you a really kind of nervous answer, because we don't know about Brexit and we don't know about fees and all the rest of it, but actually I think we can be much more confident in that. Because although these sorts of things are really going to cut across us in different ways, actually the direction of travel for the institution is a really positive one. I think we're also becoming a little bit more at ease with ourselves as an institution, and that's really important. Think about ourselves as a community. I think we're doing a lot more listening. There's more to be done, but we're doing a lot more listening. So we can see that the courses that we are offering are really, really popular, and that's a great place to be. I think that what we're doing in terms of a lot of the work in education strategy is evolving those courses with student input. That co-creation is a massively important part of it. We're required to listen quite hard to student voice. NSS is only a small part of that, of course. Not only in terms of content, so there's a lot of work on decolonising the curriculum going on, which is fantastic, and not in a confrontational space. It's actually decolonising the curriculum is simply saying, who are the really important people who've done things that aren't on the reading list at the moment? It's an academic question, it's not really a very big threatening question, I don't think. Building further the popularity of our education and making it more interdisciplinary. I think that's a really important future driver for us. And one of the other things that I think we're going to be able to build much more in terms of the education is much more in terms of undergraduate research opportunities. So being much clearer about when people are learning what is at the research forefront in their courses, but also giving students more opportunity for their own research to be heard. I think our research is growing and being very successful. I mean, last year we had the highest ever research income we've had for the university, which is a fantastic thing. But it's not just the financial input, it's of course the product that comes out of it as well. Research Excellence Framework is in a couple of years' time. We're doing work with departments at the moment to see where everybody stands. There's fabulous work going on. I mean, the last few years, the quality and the international impact of the research work at the university is really, really fantastically strong. So I think we can be really confident. And the other thing is the acceptance and support for this university in our region maybe has never been greater, maybe. And partly it's because we're of a size where we are a major employer and we have characteristics of ourselves as an employer that people really appreciate. So as an employer, we don't do 0-hours contracts. As an employer, we pay living wage foundation rates. As an employer, we will not do outsourcing. So those are all sorts of things, again, in terms of commitment of the university to our community around us that are really appreciated. And I think these are really on incredibly strong foundations, despite nonsense around us.